watching Morning at NTV.
Welcome back, and many thanks for staying with us right here on the #1 breakfast show in the country, Morning at NTV. We do take pride in the fact that we lose sleep on a weekday basis to front to you this very, very important information that you need to conquer your day, conquer your week, vis-a-vis conquer your careers. COVID-19 is still here, ladies and gentlemen. Before you leave the confines or humble abode, ensure that you're wearing a face mask and not just simply wearing one under your chin, but you're covering the hot or sensitive spots, that is your nostrils and also your mouth. 244.4 million plus infections have been noticed on the whole international stage. 4.9 million people have actually succumbed or been killed by this very heinous disease. The good news pertains to the fact that 221.4 million people have pulled through or recovered from this heinous disease, COVID-19. We are still here. COVID-19 is still the biggest reason as to why schools are pretty much under lock and key right here in Uganda. The government contends we need to actually ensure or achieve 7 million vaccinations before we even talk about reopening of educational institutions, that is in January of 2022. From the 7 million vaccinations, the target so far, only 2.6 million vaccinations have been undertaken, and out of the 8 million vaccinations vaccines government has secured, only 661, that is 661,000, came from the coffers of government. That is money that was spent by the government to secure these vaccines, but the rest were donations. So a country that is largely banking on donations, how can it achieve 7 million vaccinations, let alone 22 million vaccinations in that regard? Today, the Ministry of Education will start the process of selecting students to join Senior 1 and Senior 5. What about those who are already in Senior 1 and Senior 5? We're getting news that they will be promoted to the next class, but then they did study for only less than 2 terms. What kind of perilous culmination can come out of that directive? We do have Filbert Baguma, the Secretary General of the Uganda National Teachers Union, joining us to actually make sense of what is happening within the country as far as the selection process and the reopening of schools are concerned. A very good morning. Thank you for joining us, Filbert.
Good morning, sir.
Indeed. What do you make of this? What do you make of the decision to carry out the selection process the way it has been planned? The fact that you do have learners who are already in Senior 1 and Senior 2, now you are carrying out a selection process for those joining Senior 1 and Senior 2. What do you make of all of this? Filbert Baguma.
Yes, the whole situation is under new normal. Because
so it's warranted.
Nobody expected this.
Yes.
And therefore, the way to handle it will also be in the new normal kind of arrangement. First of all, believe it or not, we have to have those who completed the exams get to know where they are going. We all know that we have, at the entry point, we have more than 1 class. P1 will be having three cohorts, because there is P1 of 2020.
Okay.
There is P1, those who were supposed to enter P1 in 2021, and then in 2022, as we reopen, there will be those who will be making 6 years.
So those are 3 cohorts.
3 cohorts. Now, at Senior 1, we had Senior 1 of 2020, of course. They are still there. They have studied for very little time and under the new curriculum.
Yes.
Now, there are those who completed P7. And you cannot keep them there without showing them where they are going.
Yes.
So they are going for selection to determine where they will be going. For Senior 1 and then Senior 5. Also, we have the Senior 5 of 2020, and now we have those who are intending to join Senior 5.
That's the confusion right there.
Now, whether we call it Senior 5A and B, whether we call it Senior 5 2020 and 2021,
yes,
it still makes the same thing. And therefore, for managing this situation, we ought to have some of them transit. We are aware there is content that was not covered.
Yeah.
But also, we are aware we cannot keep these other classes without a candidate class. That becomes another challenge.
I see.
And therefore, there has to be an arrangement to make sure that those who were in senior 5 transit to senior 6.
I see.
Those who were in senior 3 transit to senior 4. And then the other classes also transit. Now, what is going to happen is to make sure that we look at the content that they did not cover.
I see.
And then this content is covered within the next class before they tackle anything else. And then the content they are supposed to cover within those classes is condensed, looking at the priority areas and make sure somehow we move. Now, the only challenge will be on candidate classes. These other classes, because our exams are end of cycle exams, they can still cover up within the time they have. The pressure may be on these candidate classes because someone who is going to senior 6 must cover a lot to enable this learner to join tertiary institutions and the university. And therefore, it is something that is going to take a lot of commitment and hard work from the teachers without creating unnecessary pressure to the learner.
But this selection process, do you think it is a sign that the school year 2022 might actually get back to normal? But are you worried that we are promoting learners from senior 1 to senior 2, senior 5 to senior 6, yet they've studied for only less than 2 terms?
Oh, of course, like I told you, we are under the new world order, which has been termed as new normal. We have very little time and a lot of content to cover.
This must be done.
And therefore, we cannot sit and say, now we must use the time as it used to be so that everything is covered. That may not help us to move. We have, in a way, to find a way of covering the content that is necessary. We prioritize because we don't have enough time, but we have to somehow move. Therefore, it is making sure that the learners are prepared for the next classes, but without compromising the standard.
Speaking of preparation of the learners, if you could talk to the ministry and maybe give them some kind of advice to ensure a smooth reopening of the education sector, what would that advice be?
Of course, it needs a lot of preparation. It needs a lot of engagement and consultation with the stakeholders. So that, like we have in the public domain, there are so many unanswered questions. And these unanswered questions can be answered through engagement, through consultations, to make sure that everybody is on the same page. Like we are looking at now, selection. People are saying now, why are they going for selection? But processes must go on leading to the reopening of schools so that we don't keep the learners in the dark corner. They must have hope that at some point they are going to go back to school. Yes.
Is it wishful thinking when the government says we've set ourselves a target of 7 million vaccinations by December to ensure a full reopening by January of 2022, yet we've only undertaken 2.6 million vaccinations? Can we achieve 4.5 million vaccinations by December to ensure a full reopening in 2022?
As long as the vaccines are available, then we may not say it is wishful thinking, because what matters is making sure there is availability of the vaccines at the vaccination centers, there is mobilization and sensitization of the masses, and the public will go and we shall...
Do you really think it's about the availability of vaccines, Baguma? Because we did ring fence 300,000 doses of the Sinovac vaccine for our teachers in August. It has taken us August, September, October to inoculate only 70% of these teachers and the support staff. That is only 550,000 teachers.
Yeah, but you are aware that when the directive for teachers to be vaccinated was pronounced, the vaccines were not readily available. And we also have details that teachers used to go to the vaccination centers and the vaccines were not there. And therefore, there has been back and forth. What I want to believe is that right now, like those who are going to go back to school on 1st November. If you double check, you will find most of them have at least taken the first jab. Now, the moment we have these vaccines available and communication is made, we shall hit the target as long as the vaccines are there. Yes.
Well, do you think there's a plan on how schools should be, reopened? Are we going to be doing this in a phased manner, or are we going to be seeing learners coming out in droves, all of them?
Right now, the Ministry of Education and Sports has not released the calendar. And therefore, we only can tell that what we hear is still there will be a staggered way of reopening of schools. But the president hinted that if they hit the target of those who are supposed to be vaccinated, there will be no social distance. And therefore, if there is no social distance, it would simply mean that all the classes would go in session and we move. Yeah.
What happens if we get another bout of COVID-19 infections when schools reopen? Do we go back to the fold that is COVID-19 lockdown?
Obviously, we shall cross the river when we reach there. Right now, we are hoping and praying that the situation continues to normalize so that we can get back to school reopening and have our learners go back to school.
Do you think banking on prayer, Filbert Baguma, will bring about what we need? Because we are actually talking about government not putting in place measures that will go a long way in helping private institutions that are grappling with loans resuscitate their businesses. We're talking about 58% of the secondary schools being privately run, 61% of the primary schools being privately run. So if we reopen and these institutions are not helped to maybe cover the loans they've been distressing about, don't you think we shall end up in a position whereby learners do not have where to go to study, no structures in that regard?
I want to believe that these discussions have been going on. The other day, the proprietors of private institutions were in Parliament meeting the Committee on Education, and they expressed what they feel government should do to them. And it is a call to government, because it is government's responsibility to provide education, not only education, but quality education for all. And therefore, since the proprietors of private education institutions and schools are supporting government in the provision of education to Ugandans, then government should think of ways on how to lend a helping hand to support these institutions, so that finally when reopening is due, they are able to reopen and accommodate the learners, because the children who study in private schools are not private. Similarly, the teachers who teach in private schools are not private. And therefore, government ought to think of how best they can bail out these proprietors of schools, like it has always done to other investors and traders.
Well, can we even talk about a full reopening of the education sector, minus interrogating the high rates of teacher attrition, Filbert Baguma? Out of the 550,000 teachers, it should be actually stated that not many of them will be making their way back into the school fold. So let's talk about the high rates of teacher attrition, those abandoning the profession to do alternative jobs or to seek alternative sources of livelihood. Don't you think we might end up in a situation whereby we fully reopen, but there are no teachers to actually teach the learners when we're opening January of 2022?
Obviously, government ought to have a grand plan for the reopening. And part of the grand plan should be looking at the teachers. There are those who will not come back. There are those who have retired within this period. And obviously, there are those we have lost, those who have died. And therefore, government, as part of the preparations for the reopening of schools, should be thinking about capturing those who have died, getting statistics of the teachers, because we should have the teachers at least 2 weeks to the reopening go to the institutions.
Indeed.
So that we can take stock of who is coming back and who is not coming back. But if we continue and simply wait and say the date will be this, and we wait for the teachers to come, then we may be surprised and we may have a challenge of learners coming to school and they don't have the teachers to teach them.
Indeed. Even the learners themselves, those young children, young girls who got pregnant during this COVID-19 pandemic might not get back to the school for. The psychological welfare of many of these learners should actually be looked at before we even talk about a reopening of schools. Do you think government is in a greater state to expedite any of these operations in the run-up to the full reopening in January of 2022? Inculcation of the ICT in the new curriculum and so forth. We're talking about rural areas where schools have never even seen what a computer looks like. But then we are in a pandemic where we are saying ICT is the future. Technological advancements are the future. So large and fair, how will these schools expedite the new normal, which involves the use of ICT when they do not have any knowledge on the technological advancements that have come about during this COVID-19 pandemic?
Obviously, we need to have studies in whatever we are thinking of. Because when you talk of e-learning, you have to look at the tools that are supposed to be used during the e-learning process. Government is in the process of capturing data. But believe me, in most of the schools up country, you will hardly find a smartphone in the family. And therefore, that is the beginning point to show you how the parents are not ready to support this e-learning. But we must begin from somewhere, because that is the way to go now. We must have learned lessons from this COVID-19, and therefore going forward, in the case of any other pandemic that may come, or any other thing that may come, either similar to COVID-19 or worse than COVID-19, we should be ready. We should have deliberate efforts to make sure that the learners who suffered gender-based violence during the lockdowns and school closures, we must make a deliberate effort to mobilize them, identify them,
bring them
first
back.
of all. After identifying them, then we make efforts to bring them back. These learners have got a life to live. These learners also had dreams through the education system. So we need to identify them, we need to mobilize them, we need to bring them back. Otherwise, the consequences of them keeping where they are will have dire effects on their entire life. Them as a generation and the children they are going to produce. The children will be worse than them. For them, at least they have been in school, they have dropped out, but they are children. So for us to avoid the consequences, you see the challenge with education, the consequences of education may not be seen in 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. But they will come, and at the time when they come, you may not correct the anomaly. So we need to make sure we put a lot of effort on mobilizing the learners to make sure that the consequences of COVID-19, the lockdown and the school closures do not have an after effect going forward.
Indeed. We also do know, Filbert Baguma, that the COVID-19 pandemic has widened the wealth gap between the rich and the poor. The wealth gap has also led to other inequalities when it comes to access to education. Others were actually very ably, accessing internet and other technological resources to ensure continued learning in that regard. For the poor, it was so tough. It was so tough. Others had to veer into child labor. Others had to veer into early childhood marriages and so forth because there was no other way to ensure continued learning. There was no access to ICT. So largely you could see there's a gap when it comes to access to education within this country. How do we help those learners who couldn't access ICT, who couldn't access the internet to ensure continued learning so that they catch up with those who are able to study online?
Obviously, like you are putting it right, we have got learners who have never studied from the 20th of March 2020.
Even though their institutions had a way to continue with learning.
Yes. There are those who have been learning all through.
Indeed.
There are those who accessed some bit of lessons on through radios, others through the TVs, others through print materials.
Indeed.
But there are those who have not had anything
At all.
at all. And therefore, this has widened the gap. Now, it is upon the teachers, and that's why I was saying the teachers should be in school like 2 weeks to the reopening, so that they prepare, because the learners they are going to meet are completely different. They have been in an environment or environments that are different from the teaching learning environment. The teachers themselves have been in different environments. Now, the administrators have a role to play. And that's why there is need for preparation of the teachers, both emotionally and psychologically, so that they are able to meet the demands of these learners who have been away from the teaching learning process. But we have to be aware that these learners are not at the same level in terms of what has taken place. And therefore, we have to begin from where we stopped.
Indeed.
You cannot imagine that the lessons were on radios, the lessons were on TVs, and therefore you are going to begin from where the TV lessons ended, the radio lessons ended. That will be denying these learners. And yet Uganda is a signatory to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goal number 4 specifically talks about the education that is inclusive, equitable, quality, and lifelong learning. And therefore, for us to fit within that, to make sure that we attain that by 2030, we have to make sure that these learners are brought on board so that we have the learners on the same page.
Filbert Baguma, this government had given itself a target of November this very year to reopen post-secondary institutions and tertiary institutions, given that we had achieved some 4 million vaccinations in that regard. But largely that did not happen, and government postponed the full reopening up to January of 2022 and also increased the set target from 4 million all the way to 7 million vaccinations. So speaking largely, should we anticipate another continued closure of schools if we do not hit the 7 million mark by December? Or should we throw caution to the wind, just like our neighbors in Rwanda, Kenya, who decided, you know what, even though there's a resurgence of COVID-19, the new normal is here and we need to learn to live with COVID-19. How should we go about it?
What we need to do is to make sure that, one, we are mobilizing the teachers, we are mobilizing the support staff and non-teaching staff to make sure they go for vaccination. But also the masses. And therefore what we need to do at this time is to make sure that both the categories of people who are supposed to be vaccinated, the targeted group, is to make sure they go for vaccination so that we don't prolong the school closures, we don't prolong the reopening of schools, because we need to have these learners get back to the teaching learning process. What they are going through is hell.
Finally, if you could advise teachers, school owners on how they should handle the anxiety of restarting school, what are some of those pointers?
First of all, the Ministry of Education and Sports, together with the Ministry of Health, should come up with a program to train the teachers on how to get out of this COVID-19 challenge, so that they are prepared emotionally. Some of them have lost their dear ones. Some of them suffered and healed. The others have seen those who were dying of COVID-19. And therefore, emotionally, psychologically, they need to be prepared. And therefore, the trainings should be in place to make sure they have these teachers prepared for the task ahead of them.
Secretary General of the Uganda National Teachers Union, Filbert Baguma, thank you very much for coming through to share with us right here on Morning at NTV.
Thank you.
All right. Now, you're still watching Morning at NTV. Ambassador Henry Maiga is already here. He is the Deputy Head of Mission to Abu Dhabi, and he's going to be helping us make sense of the insecurity that is actually befalling this nation and other issues pertaining to current affairs. We'll be right back.